What is going on, guys? It's Jack Gillis 1875 here, and today I'm doing a highly requested video that was also overwhelmingly voted for on the Twitter poll, and that is my guide to football in the DDR. So you guys have been taking a massive interest in East German football, which I'm really glad to see. It's really nice to see because usually don't have many people to share the interest with, so it's brilliant to see you guys taking an interest in football in East Germany. And I thought, instead of making loads of separate videos, because you guys have had a lot of questions about club football in East Germany, instead of making loads of separate videos, I decided to make one all about how club football is structured in East Germany. So that's what this guide is going to be about. It's going to be about how club football is structured in East Germany, sort of like the league system, how football worked in East Germany, like how was it associated with the state and everything, and of course state intervention, which was quite common in East Germany as well. So I hope you enjoy this video, guys. Thank you so much for showing an interest and getting involved. Thank you everybody who voted on the Twitter poll as well. So I hope you enjoy this video. Hope you learn something new about East German football. So having said that, let's jump right into it. So we're going to start off this guide by looking at how football is structured in East Germany. We're going to start off this section of the video by looking at East Germany's football pyramid. So I've made a very helpful graphic to talk about the East German league system. So at tier 1, at level 1 of East German football, you had the league that all of you have probably heard of, the DDR Oberliga, which was a 14-team league, and it worked just like any other top flight that you guys will be familiar with. It worked like the Premier League. Each team plays each other home and away, and that was it. And the season followed the regular pattern that every other league in Europe does, apart from briefly they did go on to the Soviet league system, which meant they played in the summer, but it got changed back because that wasn't really fitting in. So you had the DDR Oberliga, which functioned just like any other top flight, 14 teams, home and away, 2 points for a win, 1 point for a draw, as it was back then. Then go down to level 2 of the East German football pyramid, which was the DDR Liga. So the DDR Liga changed a lot in its time. It wasn't a full nationalised second division like you have in West Germany with Zweite Bundesliga, or in England with what was called the old Division 2 back then, Championship. Instead, the DDR Liga was regionalised, so for quite a long time they had Staffel A, B and Z. So Staffel A was the Northern Division, Staffel B was the Central Division, and then Staffel Z was the Southern Division. Unfortunately, that caused a lot of confusion, and a lot of teams got moved league a lot, so they switched it in the 70s to Staffel A and B, which so they had a Northern League and a Southern Division, North and South Division basically at that time. So that's how the DDR Liga functioned. Two teams would be in the mix for promotion. One from each of the DDR Ligas, the North and South Division, would go up automatically. Then the second in the North Division would play second in the South Division for a place in the Oberliga. And I think briefly third also got a chance to play in a playoff as well. So it got quite confusing with the DDR Liga, but more or less functioned how the National League North or South functions in England. And then eventually you had Tier 3, which were the Bezirksligen, which means the district league. So East Germany had 15 Bezirks or districts, and that was their league. So the third division was basically 15 leagues for each district of East Germany. Now after that, football was more or less Sunday league and was not recognised by the Deutscher Fußballverband, which was the East German Football Association, which is based in East Berlin. We'll be talking about them a bit later on. So the third tier of East German football is the Bezirksligen. The promotion system from the Bezirksligen is very complicated to try and explain, and I think the Bezirksligen will probably need their own video. If I'm being honest, it's wonderful how to explain that. I'm not going to do it in today's video. So that is how the East German football pyramid worked. You had 3 leagues recognised by the Deutscher Fußballverband. The Oberliga was administered as its own entity, much like the Premier League. Then you had the DDR Liga, which had a North and South Division, which was the second tier, and then you had your third tier, which was your 15 Bezirksligen, which was one for each district of East Germany. And that is how football more or less functioned in East Germany from the 70s onwards. We have a lot of stuff before the 70s, like the Battalion Mineshaft and everything like that, but it's easier to talk about football in East Germany from the 70s onwards. So now that you know a little bit about East Germany's football pyramid, we'll go on to talk about the two main competitions in East German football. So there was two main football competitions in East Germany, and the first of which we discussed in the previous section was the DDR Oberliga, which was of course the top flight of East German football. That was probably the most prestigious prize in East German football. So like I mentioned, the Oberliga, 14 teams, 2 points for a win, 1 point for a draw. Basically how all top leagues functioned in Europe at that time. So the Oberliga was the big prize in East German football, and the record holders, who are also pictured here, were Berliner Fußball Club Dynamo, or BFC Dynamo Berlin, as a lot of people know them. They are the record holders with 10 titles. They are then followed by Dynamo Dresden, who have 8 titles. So the Oberliga, like I was saying, was the prize to get your hands on in East Germany. It was like the East German Premier League. Nothing else really mattered in East Germany. It was all about winning the Oberliga. And as we'll discuss later on in the video, that had a lot of political weight to it, because football in East Germany didn't exactly work like it did in Western Europe, and we'll discuss that later on as well. So the Oberliga was basically the big premier competition in East Germany, and every team had their dream to get the Oberliga. Unfortunately, it was usually teams that had the backing of the state that would do well in the Oberliga, and BFC Dynamo, the team of the Stasi, Erich Mielke, the Stasi chief, was the club president. That led to them winning 10 titles in a row. Then Dynamo Dresden, being associated with the Volkspolizei, the East German police force, won 8 titles. So it was more or less like that. But other teams did win it, like Carl Zeiss Jena, for example, and it was a fairly competitive league up until about the 80s and BFC Dynamo's dominance in the league. So that's the first of our competitions. So the other major competition in East Germany was the FDGB Pokal. So FDGB stands for Freie Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, or in English, the Free German Trade Union. So this is pretty major and feeds into the political stuff. The FDGB was basically controlled by the SED, which was the ruling Communist Party in East Germany, and it was the only trade union that was allowed. So having the cup sponsored by the country's only trade union put a lot of weight behind the political stuff going on, and it also proved that East Germany was a socialist country because it's all for the workers and everything. So the FDGB Pokal for smaller teams, or teams that weren't as politically favourable, shall we say, was actually quite a big deal. So the FDGB Pokal worked like most trophies. It was different to the DFB Pokal because not every team could qualify. So from the Bezirksligen downwards, you had qualifying, much like the FA Cup. Lower league teams had to do pre-qualifying, and then when you reached the main stage of the competition, DDR Liga and Oberliga teams would then get put in. And it was actually, you could refuse. It was kind of an invitation only competition. You could refuse to be in it. There wasn't any formal invitation, but clubs could easily refuse, and quite a few lower league clubs did because of money and other such problems that they might have been having. But for the most part, clubs did take part. You did get a few lower league clubs going quite far in the competition, but mostly it was Oberliga clubs that dominated it. Now, as you can see there, the joint record holders of the FDGB Pokal are Magdeburg and Dynamo Dresden, who have 7 titles each. Magdeburg were very, very successful in the competition, especially in the sort of mid to late 70s. Magdeburg had a really, really good time of it. So the FDGB Pokal wasn't seen as important as the Oberliga, but it was still a big deal, especially for DDR Liga teams, the second division teams, who more often than not actually did quite well. You always had a DDR Liga team in the quarter or semi-finals, but they did have a lot of teams in it. There was well over 100 teams when you went into the first round, and that was after qualifying as well. So it was actually quite a big competition in East Germany, and for many years, especially early on, the finals got big attendances of up to about 70,000. So the FDGB Pokal was a massive deal. The final was played in one of 2 stadiums. Either played at the Walter Ulbricht, later renamed the Weltjugendstadion in East Berlin, or it was played at the Friedrich Ludwig Jahn Sportpark in East Berlin as well. A few times early on it was played in Leipzig and Weimar, but mostly it was played in East Berlin because that was the capital of East Germany. We're now going to move on to talk about the different types of football clubs you had in East Germany. In East Germany, you had 2 main types of football club. Now, East Germany being a communist country, there wasn't any football clubs privately owned, so not even owned by the fans. They weren't owned by any private individuals. They were run either directly or indirectly by the state. The first type of football club you had in East Germany was a Betriebssportgemeinschaft, or BSG for short. Now, Betriebssportgemeinschaft translates into company sports community. So these were run by factories or state companies in East Germany for their workers. Now these weren't just football clubs, you also had judo, boxing, basketball, ice hockey, athletics, all in the same club. So these were more or less sports clubs for factory workers, works teams more or less. And it was mostly factory workers that would play for them in the early days, that they'd be picked out of a pool, and that was all part of sport in the workplace. Was very, very important to the East German government. So obviously football is a big sport that's going to be associated with a factory, and these factories ran very good teams. Some of the most successful teams in East Germany were BSGs, Betriebssportgemeinschafts, and they were very, very popular amongst the workers as well. It gave them a chance to blow off steam. You could take a bit of pride in your work, and there was also a chance for inter-work rivalries. If the factory from the next town along was playing your team, you had a bit of a chance, a bit of healthy inter-work rivalries. So the Betriebssportgemeinschaft were very, very popular. We're now going to move on to foosball clubs, which are the next type of team in East Germany. So the other type of football club you had in East Germany were foosball clubs, which were football-only teams, and these were highly, highly skilled and prestigious, and only the best of the best players could get into these. So this was a programme started by the East German government to basically improve football after the East German national team got embarrassed heavily in various events and qualifiers. So they decided we're going to revolutionise football, make it more elite in the country. So football clubs were usually given preferential treatment and were very closely associated with the state. So the most notable example is BFC, Dynamo Berliner Football Club. Dynamo, they were the Stasi team, obviously, and it was usually clubs associated with the Stasi and the police that were turned into football clubs. Although there was some, like Magdeburg, that, as we'll talk about later, didn't really have any state, any state interaction. I don't know what you'd say. They didn't have any state ties, really. So there was a few like that, but these were basically elite clubs that were for football only, and only the best of the best players could play for these clubs. And this was to improve football in East Germany. Now, these football clubs became more sort of successful in the late 70s, and then obviously BFC in the 80s as well. Before then, it was the Betriebssportgemeinschaft. So you have the two main football clubs in East Germany, Betriebssportgemeinschaft and football clubs. There was others like Sportvereins and everything like that, but we'd be here all day if we were going into that. So these are the two main types. We're now going to move into some of the clubs and the state companies and everything they were associated with. So let's move on. So as previously discussed, football in East Germany, or football clubs in East Germany rather, were closely associated with state companies or state organs. In this section of the video, I will be going over some big state companies and state organs and examples of football clubs associated with them. So we're going to start off with Chemie clubs, or clubs that were associated with East German chemical plants. East Germany had a massive petrochemicals industry, especially around the modern states of Saxony and Saxony-Anhalt, and this was actually known as the Chemie-Dreieck. There's a part of East Germany known as the Chemie-Dreieck, or the chemical triangle, where there was so many chemical plants all sort of linked to each other, and it was a big industry in East Germany. So some notable examples include Hallische FC Chemie, BSG Chemie Leipzig, BSG Chemie Schkopau Buna, and BSG Chemie Zeitz. So Hallische FC Chemie were based in the district capital of the Halle district, in Halle an der Saale, and they were a pretty decent mid-table club in East Germany, I'd say. Halle had quite a big chemical works, but it also had the Wartburg car factory nearby as well. So Halle were a semi-decent sized club in East Germany, and were actually made an elite football club when the programme got rolled out. They never really had a chance to develop, because then the Wende in East Germany collapsed and sort of came along. The next one, and this is probably the one that all of you have heard of, is BSG Chemie Leipzig. Now, very, very early on in East German football, Chemie Leipzig were a massively successful club, won a lot of cups. I think they won the league once as well. So Chemie Leipzig were a big club and were very, very popular in the Leipzig district, the Bezirk Leipzig, and they're probably the most notable example and the biggest example of a Chemie club. They were closely associated with the Leipzig Chemical Works, which is sadly not there anymore. You then had the two sort of minor ones, which were Chemie Skopau Buna and Chemie Zeitz. So Chemie Skopau Buna was in the town of Skopau, and that was where they made rubber. They made synthetic rubber in Skopau. I think the works is actually still there, so that was called the Buna Rubber Company. Now, Chemie Skopau Buna only ever played one season in the Oberliga and were mostly a DDR Liga, Bezirk Liga team. They weren't really a big team, but they were quite a popular little local club and did have a few seasons, like I said, one season in the Oberliga and a few seasons sort of challenging in the DDR Liga. The next is probably the most obscure of them is Chemie Zeitz. Zeitz is a town in modern-day Saxony-Anhalt. I believe in the Bezirk Magdeburg. I'm not too up on my East German district geography. Chemie Zeitz were, again, one season in the Oberliga, firmly sort of lower league club. But again, Zeitz had a big chemical plant nearby, and it was a club for the factory workers in Zeitz. The chemical factory workers in Zeitz. There you go. Next, I'm going to move on to the railway clubs. We're now going to move on to talk about clubs associated with the Deutsche Reichsbahn, which was the East German state railway company. Now, funnily enough, for a communist country, Deutsche Reichsbahn means German Imperial Railways, and it was also the name of the railways under Nazi Germany as well. So, a bit weird why a communist country kept that, but anyway, c'est la vie. There was only really two clubs that were ever prominent within the locomotive setup. That's the club name of the East German Railways. And those were Lokomotiv Stendal and, of course, the most prominent of them, the one you guys would have heard of, Erste FC Lokomotiv Leipzig. Now, they're called Lokomotiv, and I know what you guys will be thinking. There's Lokomotiv Moscow in Russia, and there's Lokomotiv Plovdiv in Bulgaria. And yes, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you're right. It was to copy the Soviet Union to call these clubs Lokomotiv after Lokomotiv Moscow. It was to copy the Soviet Union completely, because East Germany at the end of the day was a Soviet puppet state. So, Lokomotiv Leipzig were the most successful. The two Lokomotiv Stendal had some success. They played quite a few Oberliga seasons and they got a few FDGB Pokal finals. But of course, Lokomotiv Leipzig were the most successful. Coming from a big city, they were, always going to be the most successful of the two. Stendal sort of out in the sticks a bit in the Bezirk Magdeburg. Now, Lokomotiv Leipzig won a few FDGB Pokals and got to a Cup Winners' Cup final, which has been discussed numerous times before on this channel, so you know the story. Lokomotiv Leipzig were probably very successful due to the fact they're from a city, but also because the Reichsbahn were probably the biggest non-party aligned state organ and had a lot of political power behind them, because the railways are important. So the being associated with the railways helped you as a football club. Lokomotiv Leipzig did very, very well out of this, and both clubs were elite foosball clubs. They were designated as elite foosball clubs. Lokomotiv Leipzig had a fantastic youth academy as well, so they were very, very successful. Stendal were okay, they weren't as successful, but they were decent. And they had they were just a mid-table Oberliga club that eventually slid down the leagues a bit. But more importantly, you had Lokomotiv Leipzig, which are one of the biggest clubs in the country. So there you go, those are the clubs associated with the Reichsbahn. Now we're going to move on to clubs associated with the steelworks. So now we're going to move on to talking about clubs that were associated with the steel and iron works in East Germany. Now, steel and iron were very, very important to the East German economy. They made a lot of steel and iron stuff for themselves, obviously, but also they shipped a lot of their steel and iron to other socialist countries like North Korea, China, and other countries in the Warsaw Pact bloc like Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and even the Soviet Union itself. So steel and iron was very, very important to the East German economy. That did not translate into football success, so only 4 steel or iron work clubs ever saw the Oberliga. Now, Stahltale are an honourable mention, but I couldn't find a decent picture of their badge, so I didn't add them in. Now, even though these clubs are called Stahl, that did not denote a steelworks. The clubs associated with ironworks were also called Stahl as well. Stahl literally just means steel. So the football club was Stahl. And most of them, apart from one of the clubs here who we'll talk about in a minute, were BSGs, Betriebssportgemeinschaft. So, first of all, you had Stahl Reise. Now, Reise is a town in Saxony. I believe when it was in East Germany, it was in the Bezirk Dresden. And you know, it was a small town and they had a few Oberliga seasons. They never really did well out of it and just ended up getting relegated and spent most of their East German time in the DDR Liga Staffel B, the Southern Division. You then have a team that I'm sure a lot of you already know about after a special video about them. That was, of course, Stahl Eisenhüttenstadt. Now, Eisenhüttenstadt was East Germany's model socialist town, so as such, you'd expect their football club to have a bit of success. Unfortunately, due to a certain indiscretion, if you want to find out about it, watch the video. It's interesting. So, due to a certain indiscretion that upset the state, they didn't and ended up in the Bezirk Liga. Frankfurt Oder. So they spent a lot of their time in the third division. They did have a few Oberliga seasons pre their forced relegation and then post their forced relegation. But the most successful, and I wouldn't say biggest name, but the most successful in terms of managing to keep themselves in the Oberliga and actually putting in some decent mid-table performances was Stahl Brandenburg. Now, Stahl Brandenburg were a BSG briefly. Then they got turned into a foosball club, although that came in 1989. What happened a year later? Country doesn't exist anymore, so they didn't have a chance to live up to their full potential. Now, Stahl Brandenburg are perhaps the biggest name because Brandenburg's a relatively big city. Also, they were decent, but most prominently, fun fact, Stefan Freund, the Dortmund legend, began his career at Stahl Brandenburg as well, and is a bit of a legend over in Brandenburg. So those were the three clubs, sort of biggest clubs associated with steel and ironworks. None of these clubs are overly successful, mainly because they came from provincial places like Eisenhüttenstadt and Reise and Thalle, and Brandenburg was the only really big city one, and as such they were the most successful. We're now going to move on to talk about clubs associated with sort of other factories and more general factories. So in East Germany you also had clubs that represented factories that made special things or made just general stuff. So these were clubs associated with just general factories. First of all, you had motor clubs. Now, clubs associated with motor were genuinely clubs that made machine parts. It wasn't necessarily, I know people will be hearing this and associating it with cars and everything. That wasn't necessarily the case. You did have motor clubs like in Halle that were associated with the Wartburg factory, but it was clubs that made machine parts and everything in general. So I'm going to go over some of these clubs. So you had the three motor clubs that played some time in the Oberliga. You had Motor Suhl, who were from the district capital, the Bezirk Suhl, which is now modern day Thuringia. I think the factory there was associated with motorbike production. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was associated with motorbike production and the Schwalbe moped, which East Germany are famous for. They then had Motor Weimar. Now, I'm sure Weimar, to anybody that did higher history, will be a familiar name, the Weimar Republic. Motor Weimar was associated with a machinery plant in Weimar. Then you had Motor Altenburg, which was associated with a machinery plant in Altenburg. So motor clubs were just associated with machinery plants in general. They didn't necessarily make cars or vehicles, but they made other stuff. They just basically made machinery, whether that was to do with cars or whether it was to do with making machines for other factories. That's what motor clubs were associated with. Now, motor clubs weren't exactly overly successful. These were the three that made it to the Oberliga, and they didn't do well when they were there. And Suhl have the unfortunate distinction of being the worst ever DDR Oberliga club. There will be a video coming out about that very, very soon, so keep your eyes peeled. So you had these motor clubs. They weren't overly successful, mainly because they came from provincial places and they were from factories that the state didn't view as important enough to have a good football team. So there you go. The bottom three were some notable teams that were associated with factories that made very, very special things. So first of all, you had BSG Robotron Sumerda. So the Robotron was East Germany's tech company. or computer company. So Smerde was a town where they made computers in East Germany. Now, people will be thinking East German computers can't be very good. Actually, Robotron were some of the best in the Eastern Bloc, and a lot of West German companies bought Robotron computers because they were cheaper. Now, the Robotron team never ever played in the Oberliga, but I thought I'd add them in for a bit of fun there because Robotron, it's a pretty cool name. Plus, they did actually have some successful seasons in the DDR Liga, and unfortunately failed in promotion playoffs each time. They could have been an Oberliga club, but they didn't manage to get there. They then had BSG Sachsenring Zwickau, which was the club of the Trabant factory. I'm sure everybody knows about Trabants, those little polluting cars that East Germany was famous for. Sachsenring Zwickau were actually relatively successful, especially early on in East Germany. Did very well in the original Mineshaft, which was the competition that came in before the DDR Oberliga, which was ran by the Soviet military government. They were quite successful in that. And then you have the most famous out of these companies, which was Carl Zeiss Jena, which is associated with the Carl Zeiss optics factory in Jena, which made binoculars and telescopes and stuff. And East Germany were famous for these binoculars, also made Praktika cameras as well. So Carl Zeiss Jena were the most successful. They won a few DDR Oberligas, a few FDGB Pokals, and got to a Cup Winners' Cup final where they got beat by Dynamo Tbilisi. So these factory teams, usually their success, as I was saying, ranged on how important it was to the state. So these motor teams didn't do very well at all. They were all BSGs, by the way. They're all Betriebssport Gemeinschaft. Carl Zeiss Jena was an elite foosball club. Now, Smerde maybe should have been an Oberliga team. I'm not too sure about that. Sachsenring Zwickau were a decent team, and of course Carl Zeiss Jena were very successful because that was one of the jewels in the East German industrial crown, the Carl Zeiss Jena clubs. I'm now going to move on to talk about clubs associated with mining in East Germany. So I'm now going to talk about clubs that are associated with mines in East Germany. So mining was quite important to East Germany, given that they relied on lignite coal to basically give the country power, and also East Germany had a lot of uranium mining in the Erzgebirge, the Ore Mountains, and in the Harz Mountains, which were along the border with West Germany as well. So you can split teams associated with mines in East Germany into two groups. One's associated with coal mines and one's associated with uranium mines. So I have three examples here. One is associated with coal mine, two are associated with uranium mines, because there wasn't many successful coal mine teams in East Germany. So they were all Betriebssport Gemeinschaft as well. I just like to point that out because mines, that's the most sort of working class job you can get. That's what they were associated with. So first of all, you had BSG Bliske Senftenberg. Now, Senftenberg was a very big mining town in the Bezirk Cottbus, near Cottbus itself, and they were decently successful. They never really did much in the Oberliga. They put in a few mid-table performances, and that was that, because obviously they were associated with the coal mines, and because Senftenberg was a sort of provincial town, they never really had much success, but they did decently, and that's Senftenberg. You then have BSG Wismut Gera. Now, Gera was near a uranium mine, and Wismut was the Soviet East German Joint Uranium Corporation. Now, a lot of the uranium mined in the Erzgebirge was used for Soviet nuclear power stations or Soviet nuclear missiles. So, I'd just like to point that out. These were seen as politically important teams. Now, the mine near Gera wasn't that big, which is why I suppose Wismut Gera weren't all that successful. They had a few DDR Oberliga seasons, provided a few DDR internationals. Their heyday was the 70s. Apart from that, Wismut Gera enjoyed most of their time in the DDR Liga, and actually one of the very few teams to switch Staffel a few times. They originally played in the Central Division, then they played in the Southern Division, because the Bezirk Gera was in one of these awkward places, but they were a decently successful side, Gera, although they didn't really win anything. Their biggest achievement was being runners-up in the Cup in the 50s. But apart from that, Wismut Gera, the most successful and, again, most well-known club associated with the mines was Wismut Aue, which now go by the name of Erzgebirge Aue. Now, Wismut Aue were, again, maybe they were successful because they were due to the fact, they were near a big uranium mine, but also Aue, it was also strange because Aue was a little provincial town in the Bezirk Karl-Marx-Stadt. Now, Wismut Aue were briefly called Wismut Karl-Marx-Stadt, but they changed their name back to Aue as well. And they were very successful, especially early on in East Germany. They're the first ever East German Cup winners, the first ever Oberliga champions as well, and they were a very, very successful team in East Germany, one of the most successful. I think that was probably due in part to them being near a big uranium mine, so they were very, very important. But overall, mining clubs were very, very sort of prevalent in the lower leagues of East German football. Gera and Aue were the only two that ever had any sustained period of success in the Oberliga. Aue were very, very successful in the Oberliga. They only ever got relegated once, I think. Yeah, don't quote me on that, but Aue only ever really got relegated once as far as I know. Gera were decent, but then they sort of fell away. And then you had Briska Senftenberg, which is a coal mining team that did okay, but then went into the obscurity of second and third division football in East Germany. I'm now going to move on to talk about teams from the collective farms. So now we're going to move on to talk about clubs from the collective farms. These were called Fortschritt clubs. Now, Fortschritt built tractors, but they weren't just exclusively limited to tractors. They also ran collective farms and ran cotton mills and everything like that as well. Now, in many parts of East Germany, they had a rural economy, and collective farms are very, very important to the local area. However, due to being in the middle of nowhere and being in sort of provincial backwaters, they didn't really have much success, the old Fortschritt clubs. Now, there was only ever two that reached the Oberliga. These were Fortschritt Merina and Fortschritt Bischofswerda. Now, Merina and Bischofswerda are both in the middle of nowhere and both never did very well in the Oberliga. They were successful in the DDR Liga, but they were yo-yo clubs. They come up and then go straight back down. And then because of the convoluted playoff system, they did struggle to get back up, but they were, these sorts of clubs that when they came up to the top league, they went straight back down again. It was simple because being in a rural area, it's hard to get players. Now, bearing in mind, there's no transfers in East Germany. Players are assigned to clubs by the Fußballverband. So it was just hard to get players in the local area, and any good players would be snapped up by the big clubs in the Bezirk. Like, for example, Bischofswerda, quite a lot of their promising young players were snapped up by Dynamo Dresden because they were the big club in the Dresden Bezirk. Now, Fortschritt clubs are all BSGs. I know it says Fußball Verein there. That is just after the Wende badge. I couldn't find the original East Germany one. And then you had Merina, who were a BSG. But they were BSGs because state collective farms are the most closely associated company to the government. You'd think farm teams would be more successful, but as the reasons I've given you would suggest, like I said, the reasons I've given you, they're not going to do well because they're in the middle of nowhere and they're not going to get the players and they don't have the money either. So there was also the clubs associated with the cotton mills like Fortschritt Rheinefelde, but they all never played in Bezirk Liga and the DDR Liga very, very occasionally. I'm now going to move on to talking about the clubs of the army. Next, I'm going to be talking about the clubs of the East German Army. Now, if you remember my video about Vorwärts, all this information will already be known to you, but for those who haven't seen that video, basically, the East German Army ran its own Army Sport Club at Army Sportverein. It changed its name quite regularly, and the football clubs around that were called Vorwärts, which means forward. Very socialist sounding name there. Now, you had sort of two clubs, or they're the same club, but I'm going to talk about them first. They were the most successful, which were Vorwärts Berlin, Vorwärts Berlin and Vorwärts Frankfurt Oder. So Vorwärts Berlin were very, very successful. Now, being associated with the army was a good thing because the army was an entity in its own right, and of course a lot of army generals have a lot of power within the government in these sorts of countries. No different in East Germany. So the big army generals saw to it that their team would do well until the Stasi and the Volkspolizei came on the scene, which we'll talk about later when we go over the Dynamo clubs. Now, the Vorwärts were very, very successful, especially in the sort of 60s. Then Vorwärts Berlin moved to Frankfurt, and then they were decent as well. They spent a lot of seasons in the Oberliga, and like I said, being funded by the army and being associated with the army meant even when you were in the lower leagues, you still had a good time of it, and you'd usually come straight back up because the army were giving you plenty of marks to make sure that you could come right back up and represent the army. And there was quite a few seasons where the army were represented. Then there was a few scenes where they weren't. And eventually, when the army saw the way the wind was blowing, they changed their name to Victoria. Now, there was another Feuerwehrts club outside of Berlin, and then they moved to Frankfurt. So like I said, for anybody that hasn't watched that video, the context to this is Feuerwehrts Berlin got moved to Frankfurt Oder because there was a big military base there, and the Dynamo club of the Stasi didn't want to be sharing the city with the army, so they booted them out to Frankfurt. There was another less successful army sport club, more closely associated with the Volksmarine, which was the East German Navy. That was ASV Feuerwehrts Stralsund. Now, Stralsund was a sort of big naval place within East Germany, and also there was a few Soviet naval bases nearby there as well. So unlike the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union, each club, and in fascist countries, for example Francoist Spain, each part of the army had its own sport club. In East Germany that wasn't the case. It was all under the Army Sportverein. So Stralsund was associated with the Navy. They were never really that great because the Navy weren't really important to East Germany. East Germany didn't have much of a coastline, plus the Soviets did much of the protecting of the East German coastline anyway. So Feuerwehrts Stralsund played a few seasons in the Oberliga, but they weren't that great and ended up back in the obscurity of DDR Liga and Bezirksliga football. But the most successful was Feuerwehrts Berlin, who moved to Feuerwehrts Frankfurt Oder after the Stasi decided they'd boot them out. So, like I said, being associated with the army was a big thing for them. It was meant they were very, very successful. Also, soldiers played for the team as well, which meant you had loads of players to pick from because they were all basically in a peak of physical fitness being in the army, and well disciplined as well. Now, people will be wondering, were they BSGs, were they foosball clubs? They were neither, really. I mean, Feuerwehrts were technically a foosball club, but the army ran its own sports and weren't really in line with the Deutsche Fußballverband. Now, they played in the league system and everything like that, and they were members, but the army sort of ran things in-house, so it was part of the Army Sportverein. Now, I didn't really mention that because there was only a few, and the army were more successful in other sports, for example, ice hockey. So, in a football context, they were neither a football club nor a BSG. They were sort of their own thing. So there you go, I just want to get that out of the way. We're now going to move on to the clubs of the Stasi and the Volkspolizei. We're now going to move on to talk about the Dynamo football clubs, which were associated with the Stasi and the Volkspolizei. And there's a reason why the Dynamo clubs were very successful, well, two of them at least, because being associated with the secret police and the normal police means you have friends in high places and the state is going to favour you. Now, everybody knows about the Stasi, East Germany's infamous secret police force, which is probably one of the most brutal and repressive in the history of mankind. They then had the Volkspolizei, which were the normal police force and tasked with keeping the rule of law in East Germany. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. It's like Lokomotiv, they've copied the Soviet Union. Yes, they have. Dynamo, obviously, in the Soviet Union was the police club as well, like Dynamo Kiev, Dynamo Minsk, Dynamo Tbilisi and Dynamo Moscow. Now, before that, the Stasi didn't really have their own club, and the Volkspolizei had their own sport group at SG Volkspolizei. Now, Mielke, who was the president of Dynamo and the Minister for State Security, changed his mind and decided, well, amalgamate them, copy our pals in the Soviet Union and rename them Dynamo. So that was that, to bring them in line with the Soviet Union, like locomotive clubs. So there's 4 examples of Dynamos I'm going to go over. So we're going to start off with perhaps the most famous, or should I say infamous one, and that was Berliner Fußball Club Dynamo, or more commonly known as BFC Dynamo or Dynamo Berlin. That was well and truly the club of the Stasi. Erich Mielke, the infamous Minister for State Security, was the club president of BFC Dynamo, and BFC Dynamo were the most successful club in the history of East German football, winning 10 Oberliga titles in a row. Now, make of that what you will. Was it done legitimately? Probably not. There is stories of Mielke threatening players and the Stasi arresting referees and bribing them and everything. And it is very suspect how a club with such friends in high places like Mielke managed to win 10 titles in a row and get all the best players. But like I said, make of it what you will, there's very scant evidence since the Stasi were very efficient in destroying most of the files. So BFC Dynamo were the most successful club in the country and were probably one of the most hated as well. Now, on the flip side, you have what I like to call the brothers Dynamo. Now, Dynamo Dresden, funnily enough, were the second most successful team in the country, winning 8 Oberliga titles and were the joint record holders of the cup with Magdeburg, as previously discussed, winning 7 cups. So Dynamo Dresden didn't have as obvious connections to the state as BFC Dynamo. They were associated with the Volkspolizei and probably had some very important friends in the Interior Ministry and the police in general up at Kaiblstrasse in East Berlin, where the police were headquartered. But Dynamo Dresden was successful mainly because they had a good crop of players and they were very well supported, genuinely very well supported by the people of East Germany, leading to them being called the Bayern Munich of East Germany because they had so many fans who were supported up and down the country. Now, like I said, Dynamo Dresden were obviously, with their connections with the police, were very, very, very successful. You can't ignore that. But also, I think they were probably just genuinely good as well. Dynamo Dresden were a very, very popular club. Like I said, didn't have as obvious connections to the state as BFC Dynamo did. So those are the two major brothers Dynamo, the major Dynamo sports clubs. You then had the two lesser Dynamo sports clubs, which were Dynamo Schwerin, which was up in the north of East Germany, and Dynamo Fürstenwalde from a small town in Brandenburg. So Schwerin and Fürstenwalde were both homes to police and Stasi academies. So as such, these two clubs, which spent most of their time in the DDR Liga and the Bezirksliga, were, you know, these were acted as feeder clubs because it was young cadets. They'd play football for these two clubs and they'd eventually, if they were good, end up at either Dynamo Dresden or BFC Dynamo. Now, Schwerin and Fürstenwalde had a decent amount of local support. I mean, in the local areas you'd find that people were tended to speak their mind a bit more, so a club associated with the Stasi and the police weren't going to be that popular, but certainly the local police force would be very supportive for these two clubs. They spent most of the time in the lower leagues of East German football, but were, for all intents and purposes, youth clubs for the two big Dynamo clubs. Now, why were the Dynamo clubs so successful? Like I said, Erich Mielke, who was probably the second most powerful man in the country behind Honecker, or maybe even the most powerful as the head of the Stasi, was the president of the Dynamo Sports Club. So he had a lot of influence there. And being associated with the police and the Stasi is going to help you because they're essentially the uniformed muscle of the state. They're going to enforce what the state wants, so they're going to keep them on. The state are going to keep them on side by making the football club successful. Now, people will be wondering, Dynamo Dresden and Fürstenwalde were both Sportgruppes. They were elite football clubs or foosball clubs, but they did keep their Sportgruppe titles. Schwerin and BFC Dynamo were both foosball clubs and were football only entities, although Dynamo Sports Club wider did have ice hockey and everything like that. So, like I said, these are probably the most infamous, and aside from Dynamo Dresden, probably the most hated, which is why, you know, Fürstenwalde and Schwerin changed their name. Schwerin are now Mecklenburg Schwerin, Fürstenwalde are now Union Fürstenwalde. But Dynamo Dresden and BFC Dynamo enjoyed support and enjoyed success due to their connections with the state. I'm now going to move on to talk about teams that weren't necessarily connected to a state organ or company. So not all football clubs in East Germany necessarily had an apparent connection to the state or even a connection at all. These clubs tended to be at low league level where the state just didn't care, or they tended to be clubs that were earmarked to be elite football clubs and were sort of left alone to garner success. So these clubs tended to be lower league, like I was saying, but there was a few in the Oberliga, and these examples were Union Berlin, I'm sure everybody's heard of them, Hansa Rostock, FC Karl-Marx-Stadt and 1. FC Magdeburg. Now, there's a few reasons why these clubs weren't associated with the state or had necessarily apparent connections with the state. Now, for Union, it was because they came from a district of Berlin where there was a lot of anti-state activity. Köpenick was not exactly happy with the East German government, and Union were sort of left to their own devices. Now, they were called Union due to being associated with the trade unions before Ulbricht decided to form the FDGB, so which we were talking about earlier. So Union were associated with trade unions, but that sort of fell away. Union were never really associated with the state in any apparent way, and also had a lot of fans that were rebellious against the state as well. So you had Union Berlin, and they kept a very rare title for East Germany, Erste FC, which was a pre-war name for a lot of teams as well. And there was only 3 in East Germany: Magdeburg, Union, and of course Lokomotiv Leipzig. So there was Union, and they were okay. They won the cup, they had a few Oberliga seasons, but due to the fact that they didn't have any state backing, as far as I'm aware of, they spent most of their time in the DDR Liga. You then had FC Hansa Rostock, again another elite foosball club. Now, you could say Hansa Rostock were associated with shipbuilding and the shipyards in Rostock, because that's where they probably got a lot of their backing from, although there was Schiffbau teams that were in the lower leagues, so nobody really knows how Hansa Rostock had a connection with the state, if any at all. But they were a very successful club in East Germany, especially at the end, and were an elite football club. Then I had FC Karl-Marx-Stadt. Now, Karl-Marx-Stadt was another model socialist city and was renamed after, of course, Karl Marx. I'm sure everybody knows who Karl Marx is. He's a guy with a big bushy beard that invented communism. So obviously being named after the guy that your whole country's based off is enough to sort of make you successful. Karl-Marx-Stadt won one Oberliga title, actually. And this is one of the very few groups of clubs where each club here won something. So Karl-Marx-Stadt won one Oberliga title, and actually relatively successful. It was maybe due to the name of the city, but also the fact that they had a lot of backing from the local party, even though they weren't really linked to a state company as such. Then eventually, it's probably the most famous and successful one here, Magdeburg, who won a few Oberliga titles, a few FDGB Pokals, and of course the only East German club to win a European competition when they won the Cup Winners' Cup in 1974. Now, Magdeburg used to have a few state organisations attached to it. They were originally Aufbau Magdeburg, which is construction workers, and then there were Motor Magdeburg Sud for a little while. But eventually, when the football club system came in, they got earmarked to be one and were renamed Erste FC Magdeburg, and that actually turned out very, very well for Magdeburg, and they got a lot of success with it. Now, Magdeburg were probably one of the very few teams that weren't connected to the state in any apparent way that actually did well within the East German game. So Magdeburg are an exception rather than the rule, but they were very successful. So you had these clubs that for various reasons, like Union, they were just annoyed the state, so didn't really have any much to do with them. Or you had Magdeburg that did have a lot of state involvement but just didn't have it apparently. Or you had Karl-Marx-Stadt, similar to Rostock, who nobody really knows. So there you go. I thought I'd go over those clubs because not every club in East Germany was associated with a state organ or a state company. We're now going to move on to the last section of the video, which is talking about political intervention within East German football. So now you know how club football was structured in East Germany and sort of all the different clubs you had in East Germany and types of clubs you had as well. So very briefly before I sign off for today, and it is important to the video, I wanted to talk about political intervention within the East German game. The SED, the Communist Party in East Germany, had the final say on everything that happened in football. So basically, my little graphic here sums it up perfectly. Do what we say. The Deutsche Fußballverband had to answer to the SED, and effectively the Football Association was an extension of party leadership and was treated just like any other ministry within the country. Football had to be brought in line with what the government, the socialist government, wanted and viewed. You know, it all had to fit in. Now, like you guys know, with my Stahl-Eisenhüttenstadt video, you even step a little bit out of line, there's going to be bad consequences for it. So basically, to use Eisenhüttenstadt as an example, they'd paid their players too much, which was breaking the principles of socialism, and they critiqued local party leadership. So what happens? The local party leadership go to the Deutsche Fußballverband, kick them out the league. The Deutsche Fußballverband, because it was mostly party bigwigs in the Deutsche Fußballverband, go, okay, we'll do that for you, Mr. Honecker. And there you go, Eisenhüttenstadt booted down into third division football. And that is how it worked in East Germany. There wasn't any say-so from the football authorities. The government got directly involved quite a lot. And now, of course, this also worked the other way around. You have Stahl-Eisenhüttenstadt, who upset the government and got busted down a few leagues, and it happened to quite a few other clubs. But then it can also work the other way around, where if you're in with the state, well, you're going to be very, very successful. Of course, BFC Dynamo had Erich Mielke as a club president. That's a friend in a very high place. And coincidentally, they won 10 league titles in a row. So the East German government had a lot of say-so in what happened within club football. And this happened to how clubs were named. The East German government could move clubs at a whimsy if they felt like it. So if it took the fancy to do so, they did it. You know, for example, you take Hansa Rostock. They used to be in a town called Leute down near the Czech border, and suddenly the East German government went, well, Rostock doesn't have a club, move them up there. That as simple as that. There wasn't any say, so they had to do it. Same with Verwärts, they were moved as well. Dynamo Dresden, when they were called Volkspolizei Dresden, were forced up to East Berlin because the capital didn't have a representative of the police there. They eventually became BFC Dynamo. It happened to various clubs. They were renamed, they were reformed, they were forced to move, all because the party said so. So basically the Football Federation didn't have any say in the matter. The Deutsche Fußballverband, the DFA, didn't have any say in the matter whatsoever. You had to do what the Communist Party told you to do. That was simple as that. And I don't over-exaggerate when I say they even had player transfers. They could decide what player goes to what club. Now, they didn't have a transfer system in East Germany because of the way the league worked. It was technically amateur, so players couldn't be bought and sold. They were given little bonuses for joining clubs and so on and so forth, but they couldn't be bought and sold. So the state used to go, well, he looks good, move him to a Dynamo club, or this player's crap, he's getting moved there. Literally, it was local party leadership that made these decisions. Club managers didn't do it, football authorities didn't do it, it was local party leadership, or even at a national level with some of the bigger clubs as well. So that, I think, is very, very important when you talk about football in East Germany. How clubs did was based on where they were from. They were only interested in big cities doing well, like Magdeburg, Berlin and everything like that, and Leipzig and Dresden. And it was also based on how important your club was to what your club was associated with to the state. For example, chemical plant teams did well because chemical plants are important. Vismut teams did well because you're mining uranium for the Soviet Union. Dynamo teams did well because they just so happened to be associated with the state security. That is how football worked in East Germany. The state had the final say on everything. You know, and that was it. The football authorities had very little say in it. So guys, that's basically, I thought it was very important that we had to get that added in about football, because to understand football in East Germany, club football in East Germany, you need to talk about the state's involvement within club football as well. So that's that little bit for you guys. I'm now going to cut to my outro. So guys, that was my guide to club football, or football in the DDR. Like I said, it was the most popular option by a long shot on that Twitter poll. Plus I've been getting loads and loads of questions about East German football as well from you guys. So I thought, instead of making individual videos and spreading it out over weeks, I thought I'd make a guide to East German football, going over how it was structured, all the different types of clubs, and of course that brief little bit about the political involvement, which is very, very important. So as always, I enjoy making these videos. I got a bit creative with this one with the graphics as well, so I hope you enjoyed the graphics and I hope you found all the information interesting. And it's brilliant to see you guys taking an interest in East German football. Like I said, it's something that I very rarely get to share with people, so thank you so much for taking an interest and asking your questions and getting involved, guys. Keep it up. I'm really looking forward to doing more videos like this. As always, if you've enjoyed it, leave a like, because then I'll know to make more content like this. If you've got any feedback that you'd like to give, please leave a comment. I'm open to new ideas. I'm open to hearing what you guys have to say. It's really interesting to get involved. What sort of club would you support if you were an East German football fan? That's what I want to know. Would you support a Motor club? Would you support a Vismut club? Would you support a Dynamo club? Which one would it be? I'd like to hear from you guys on that one as well. So get involved in the discussion, put it in the comments, say it on Twitter, whatever you guys want to do. Like I said, I really hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed watching it, as much as I enjoyed making it, and I hope you learned something about East German football. So as always, guys, like I said, you know the drill. Smash that like button, leave a comment if you've got any feedback, and if you're new to the channel, please subscribe for unique footballing content like this. I will see you all in a while. Jack out.